What does an apostle, two missionaries, a king, an architect, a chancellor, a man from Who, and a Renaissance martyr have in common? If you'd said Rochester Cathedral, you'd be absolutely right, not least because it's in the title of the video. These 8 figures were incredibly important to the cathedral's earliest history, and in the 19th century they were made into a sculptural form of a line of these 8 figures underneath the giant organ that sits within the central tower that dates back all the way to the late 12th century. And these sculptures are facing the nave section, the largest expansive area within the cathedral building itself. So over the course of the next 2 videos, I'm going to be going through each of these 8 characters of significance, looking at their earliest histories and how they are associated with Rochester Cathedral. So without further ado, let's get on with things. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. Today, looking at the 8 significant figures of Rochester Cathedral. So, let's start at the beginning, nearly 2,000 years ago. Why? Well, you'll find out. Our first character of significance is Saint Andrew, one of the 12 apostles to Jesus himself, who was born in the year 5 and died roughly between the years 60 and 70. Now, not much is really known about St. Andrew's life before becoming an apostle, other than the fact that he had a brother who also became an apostle, he was a fisherman by trade, and that he was born in Galilee, over in the Middle East, which at that time was part of the expansive Roman Empire, but today is part of the little region known as the Golan Heights. It's probably an obvious statement to make, but St. Andrew the Apostle never actually went to England in his lifetime. This is a fledgling new religion in the 1st century. And so the majority of Christianity is going to be focused around Jerusalem and the areas surrounding these significant sites of religious importance. Places which today are comprised within Israel, Syria, Jordan, and maybe the sort of northeastern parts of Egypt. So St. Andrew's significance on Rochester Cathedral was not based around him actually being there, but because of the missionaries who nearly 600 years later arrived to spread the word of Christianity within England. And these missionaries, who had been sent by Pope Gregory I and under the sort of leadership of Augustine, later Saint Augustine, had travelled from a monastery in Rome dedicated to St. Andrew. And so when they were founding the cathedral, or the priory before that, in Rochester, it too was dedicated to St. Andrew. We now come to the second character of significance. Funnily enough, one of those missionaries that had arrived in England in the late 6th century, whose name was Justus. And Justus was to become the first Bishop of Rochester, and the man who founded and consecrated the ground for which the cathedral sits on today. But back then it was referred to as the Priory of St. Andrew. Now, much like Andrew the Apostle, there is not much that we know about Justus's early life before he arrived in England. And even then, that is under some dispute. Some argue that Justus arrived alongside Augustine in the year 597. But there are some that argue that actually Justus was part of a second group who arrived after Augustine 4 years later in the year 601. Now you will notice that I've said that Justus arrived and the missionaries arrived in the late 6th century. That's not because I am acknowledging one argument or another, but because it is roughly in that same ballpark, if there is a couple of years difference. Now, whilst Canterbury was chosen as the first primary site to build a cathedral, monastic, priory space for this founding of Christianity within England, Rochester was considered second. Now, the reason being is that the local king of Kent, known as Ethelbert, had a palace within Canterbury. So it was a natural progression to have the main hub, the marker point for English Christianity based in Canterbury as well. A fact, of course, which still remains to this very day. But the other reason why Rochester was considered second was because it's the second city within the Kingdom of Kent. But more to the point, it was on Watling Street, the old Roman road that was still being used in the late 6th century to travel from London through to the coastline, to the port of Dover. A road which was still being used well into the age of pilgrimages in the medieval period, and which today is now classed as the A2 road. On the 28th of April in the year 604, King Ethelbert wrote a charter granting the land within Rochester to have a priory space built upon it. Very soon after the granting of this charter and the founding of the Priory of St Andrew, Justus was proclaimed as the first bishop of Rochester. But when Ethelbert died in the year 616, the Anglo-Saxons within the Kingdom of Kent started to protest, and a backlash against these Christian missionaries ensued, resulting in Justus fleeing the country towards Gaul, which is part of modern-day France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, etc. But within a year, the new King of Kent, Eadbald, allowed these missionaries to return to England and for Justus to return as the Bishop of Rochester. Justus would remain as the Bishop of Rochester until the year 624, passing it on to his successor called Romanus, who coincidentally was another one of the early missionaries that arrived in England. But Justus didn't retire. He in fact got a sort of career promotion, if you will, and became the 4th Archbishop of Canterbury. For in the near 30 years that Christianity had been within the county of Kent and spreading throughout England, there had been 4 different Archbishops of Canterbury, 4 different leaders of the English Church. The first being Augustine, of course, and the 4th being, of course, Justus. As Archbishop of Canterbury, Justus proclaimed in the year 625 that his fellow missionary Paulinus should become the Bishop of York, as Christianity was now spreading through the Kingdom of Northumbria and further still into the north of England. But what of Paulinus? For he is the next character of significance in this video. Very little is known about his early life. He arrived in England in the year 601 with that second group of missionaries. He remained in Kent right up until he was proclaimed the Bishop of York in the year 625, on the 21st of July to be specific. And the reason why he was proclaimed thus is so that he could ordain the marriage between the King of Kent's sister, the Princess Ethelberg, to the King of Northumbria, King Edwin. This was a short-lived position for Paulinus, because on the 12th of October 633, King Edwin of Northumbria was killed at the Battle of Hatfield Close, fighting against the combined alliance of the King of Gwynedd and the King of Mercia. Paulinus went into exile, accompanied by Ethelberg, the former queen, as well as Ethelberg's daughter and Ethelberg's grandson as well. They exiled themselves back to the Kingdom of Kent, where soon after arriving and into the year 634, Paulinus was proclaimed the third Bishop of Rochester, succeeding old Romanus, a position that Paulinus would hold until his death on the 10th of October in the year 644. Now, in order to talk about our fourth character of significance, we have to go slightly back in time, for our next character is King Ethelbert, the King of Kent. Ethelbert was born at some time roughly in the year 550 and came to the Kentish throne in the year 589. Now, at the beginning of that decade, Ethelbert married Bertha, who was the daughter to the King of the Franks. Now, the Kingdom of the Franks comprises of areas and region which make up modern-day France. Now, the Frankish people had already been converted to the Christian faith, and under the marriage contract between Bertha and Ethelbert, it was agreed that Bertha was allowed to continue practicing her Christian faith, despite Ethelbert not being a Christian at that time in 580. So Bertha brought over her own personal chaplain and had constructed a Christian chapel attached to their palace, which is called, and still exists today, the Church of St. Martin of Tours, the oldest church within the British Isles and, of course, within England. So even before the formal introduction to Christianity that Augustine and his missionaries came with in the year 597, Bertha was already bringing forth the Christian faith and the Christian ideas to England or to Kent, albeit on a smaller scale and probably just within the courtly circles. It is probably not a far stretch to consider that it was Bertha who had sort of convinced Ethelbert in the year 597 to allow Augustine and his Christian missionaries to arrive in the Kingdom of Kent. Ethelbert was likely halfway converted to the Christian faith anyway, having been sort of influenced by Bertha. And in the same year, 597, Ethelbert granted Augustine and his missionaries the land for a priory to be built on what is now situated Canterbury Cathedral. And of course, as previously mentioned, Ethelbert granted the land in Rochester for a priory to be built in the year 604. Ethelbert was not just influential as a Christian, but he was also influential as a tradesman, policy, and a lawmaker as well. The Kingdom of Kent was just a skimming stone's throw away from the continent, if you go via the port of Dover, of course. So trade was very easy and very lucrative for the Kingdom of Kent. It was so lucrative, in fact, that Ethelbert set up the first coinage production, the first mint within one of the English kingdoms, for the first time since the Romans had left in the 5th century. And although Ethelbert was not considered to be the most powerful of the English kings, that apparently was Edwin up in Northumbria, he still was influential in creating the Law of Ethelbert, a 90-section peace charter which was written in about 602 or 603. The first charter of law to be written in the Germanic language, a sort of forerunner to our very own English language. But the only known version to still exist of Ethelbert's laws comes from a copy, a reproduction that was made for the Textus Rofensis in the early 12th century. And I think with the conclusion of Ethelbert's life, and making sure this video doesn't run on too long, I shall end the video here. Thank you for watching this part 1 video of these 8 significant characters associated with Rochester Cathedral, and I hope to see you for part 2 when I look at the later history of Rochester Cathedral's 8 significant characters. Have a good day, and I shall see you later.